The tank had no name painted on its hull. Most crews named their Shermans: Lucky Lady, Devil's Due, Memphis Belle of the Ardennes. But this one was blank. Its commander, a 26-year-old sergeant from Abilene, Kansas, had refused to name it. He said naming a tank was like naming a cow you intended to slaughter. You'd only make it harder on yourself. That tank, hull number C-17, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, sat in a ditch outside the French town of Arracourt on the morning of September 19, 1944, with its gun barrel bent at a 40-degree angle, its driver's hatch welded shut by a direct hit from a Panther round, and its engines still running. The sergeant was not inside it. He was 300 meters away, in a drainage canal, leading 7 men and 1 functioning .30 caliber machine gun against the flank of an SS Panzer Grenadier Company that had no business being there, in a town that Allied intelligence had declared, in writing that same morning, to be lightly defended. 41 Americans went into Arracourt that morning. 22 came back by nightfall, but they took the town. And what happened in those 9 hours? The decisions made in mud and smoke, the orders defied, the civilians hidden in a butcher's cellar, the German field commander who would later write in his diary that he had never, in 3 years of war, been more surprised by anything, is the story of exactly why Panzer commanders across the Western Front had begun to fear what American armor had become. What turned the army that Germany dismissed as amateurs into the force that broke their finest doctrine? To understand what happened at Arracourt, you need to understand what it meant on a map. By mid-September 1944, General George S. Patton's Third Army had achieved something that military historians still debate as either the most brilliant or most reckless advance in American military history. In 11 weeks since the breakout from Normandy's hedgerows, Third Army had driven over 400 miles through France, consuming fuel at a rate that terrified Allied logistics officers and exhilarated everyone in Patton's command. The spearhead, the 4th Armored Division, had become Third Army's sharpest instrument, a force so practiced in high-speed exploitation that its crews ate, slept, and repaired their tanks without fully stopping the advance. Arracourt was a crossroads town in the Lorraine region, 30 kilometers east of Nancy. A town of perhaps 1,200 people, a church, a butcher, 2 cafes that had been closed since 1942, and a network of roads that, on a military map, looked like the hub of a wheel. Control Arracourt, and you controlled movement through an entire sector. German planners knew it. Patton knew it. And in the last week of September, both sides were sending forces toward it simultaneously, except that American intelligence didn't know the German force was already there, and the Germans didn't know that American armor was coming at them faster than any of their models had predicted was possible. The man tasked with taking the town was Staff Sergeant Raymond Donahue, 28 years old, of the 37th Tank Battalion, Charlie Company. Born in Abilene, Kansas, in 1916. His mother still worked at the wheat elevator his grandfather had built. He had a photograph of her tucked behind his compass, the one inside the tank, not the field compass, the one that stayed with the machine, even if he had to leave it. Donahue had joined the Army in 1941, converted to armor in 1942, after washing out of flight school on account of depth perception problems, and had spent 18 months training at Fort Knox before arriving in England. By September 1944, He had 7 weeks of combat experience, which in the breakout period meant more actual tank-on-tank engagement hours than most German crews had seen in a year of static defensive warfare on the Eastern Front. He had destroyed 4 German armored vehicles by confirmed kill. He had been blown out of 1 tank and walked away, and his crew called him Ray. His officers called him Sergeant. His radio operator, Private First Class Elias Morrow, 20 years old, from Shreveport, Louisiana, called him Sarge, and wrote to his mother that Donahue was the kind of man who already knows where you're going wrong before you've done it, like he's reading a book that's 2 chapters ahead of the one everyone else is on. The plan, as designed by battalion headquarters and filtered through company command, was straightforward in the way that plans always are before contact with the enemy. Charlie Company, 12 Shermans, 4 tank destroyers, attached from the 704th TD Battalion, and a platoon of armored infantry, would advance along the D674 road from the southwest, seize the crossroads at Arracourt's center, and hold it until the battalion's main body consolidated. Intelligence had identified the town as defended by a rear area security element. A few dozen Wehrmacht soldiers, no armor, no anti-tank positions of significance. The attached French partisan contact, a man the Americans called Marcel, whose real name nobody in the company had ever been told, had confirmed the German strength as minimal. What headquarters didn't know, because Marcel didn't know, was that on September 17th, 48 hours before the operation, the 113th Panzer Brigade had rerouted through Arracourt, not occupying it permanently, passing through, but leaving behind, as it passed, a reinforced company of Panzer Grenadiers and 4 Mark V Panthers that had thrown a track in the town square and been repaired by the brigade's own mechanics before moving on. The Panthers were gone. The Panzer Grenadiers were not. And 40 kilometers away, the 111th Panzer Brigade, a formation so newly assembled that some of its tank crews had never fired their main guns at a live target, was moving toward the same crossroads, having been ordered by 5th Panzer Army Headquarters to recapture the Lorraine Corridor before the Americans could exploit it. This was the formation that American intelligence had detected vaguely as elements of unspecified German armor, somewhere in the operational area. At German 5th Panzer Army Headquarters, on the evening of September 18, the Corps commander, General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, had reviewed his subordinates' assessment of the coming action. His brigade commander, a man who had built his reputation on the Eastern Front against Soviet armor, had been characteristically confident. The Americans, he argued, were road-bound, predictable, and incapable of the flexible response that armored warfare demands. They were, in his assessment, infantry with tanks rather than tank soldiers. His after-action memo, captured later and translated by Third Army intelligence, recommended minimum preparation because the approaching American force would follow their road exactly and attack precisely where they were expected. He was wrong about everything except one thing. They did follow the road, at least at first. Charlie Company moved out before dawn on September 19, 1944. Donahue's tank, hull number C-17, still unnamed, led the column. He stood in the commander's hatch with his binoculars and watched the dark shapes of French farmland slide past on either side of the D674. The road was paved, which was rare, and the fields to either side were harvested stubble, flat, open, the kind of terrain that should have made observation easy in daylight, and made Donahue deeply uneasy in the dark, because it meant that anyone watching the road could see everything on it while remaining invisible themselves. Morrow, in the radio seat, had been trying to raise the French contact, Marcel, since midnight. Marcel was supposed to meet them at a crossroads 3 kilometers before Arracourt with updated intelligence on German positions. The rendezvous point came and went. The road was empty. "Nothing," Morrow said. Donahue kept his binoculars up. "Keep trying." The first sign that something was wrong was the chickens. A farmhouse 200 meters off the right side of the road had chickens in the yard, not unusual, but they were disturbed, moving in tight, agitated circles in the pre-dawn gray. The way chickens moved when something large and alarming had recently passed through. Donahue had grown up on the edge of farming country. He knew what spooked chickens looked like versus chickens just waking up. He called a halt. His platoon leader, Lieutenant Frank Bauer, 24, of Cincinnati, Ohio, came forward on the radio immediately. "Ray, what's the problem? We're behind schedule already." "Something moved through that farm. Recent. And Marcel's not at the RV. Intel says the road's clear. Intel hasn't seen these chickens." Bauer told him to move. The schedule was the schedule. Donahue moved. At 06:12, as the column crested a shallow rise in the road with Arracourt's church steeple visible perhaps 800 meters ahead, the world came apart. The ambush was not the 4 Panzer grenadiers with a Panzer Faust that the scenario had predicted. It was a reinforced platoon, 43 German soldiers, with 2 towed 75mm anti-tank guns dug into positions on either side of the road, positioned at an angle that caught the column in a crossfire before any Sherman could turn its hull to face the threat. The first round hit C-17's right track. The second round, 2 seconds later, hit the driver's compartment of the second tank in the column, Sergeant Willie Tate's C-22, Maggie May, named for his daughter, at 0 range from the right side gun. Maggie May did not burn immediately. It simply stopped. Tate was unconscious from the overpressure. His loader, Private James Cook, 19, of Memphis, Tennessee, would later write from an Army field hospital. "I don't know how long I was out. When I came up the hatch, the road was full of noise, like nothing I'd heard. I could see Ray's tank sitting at an angle, with smoke coming off the right side. And I remember thinking very calmly that the gun barrel was bent. Just thinking, that is not supposed to look like that. The way you'd notice a tree bent funny in a park. Then I was in the ditch, and I don't know how I got there." Donahue was already out of C-17, in that ditch, with his 45 and his radio operator and 6 armored infantrymen who had bailed from their half-track when the lead tank stopped. The tank commander's instinct, the one Patton's training had hammered into every officer and NCO in Third Army, was not to stay with a disabled vehicle and call for help. It was to move, find the ground, deny the enemy a static target. Then the radio call came, and Morrow had salvaged the portable radio from C-17's storage. It was scratching and cutting out from the concussion, but functional. Battalion was on the line with a message that Donahue described in his after-action report as the single most useless thing anyone has ever said to me during an emergency. The new orders: hold position at the current grid reference. A second company, Able Company was being redirected to support. Estimated arrival, 90 minutes. Current position was the kill zone. 90 minutes in the kill zone was a death sentence. Donahue looked at Morrow. Morrow looked at the radio. "Sir," Morrow said into the handset, keeping his voice completely flat, "we are receiving fire from fortified AT positions at grid." A burst of machine gun fire interrupted him. Both men pressed flat into the mud. "Request permission to maneuver." "Hold position," Battalion repeated. "Able is en route." Donahue took the handset, listened to the static for exactly 3 seconds, and handed it back. "Tell them the radio went out," he said. Morrow stared at him. "Tell them," Donahue said, "the radio went out." At that moment, 2 kilometers away, an officer of the 111th Panzer Brigade was watching the ambush through his binoculars and noting with satisfaction in his field log that the American column had been stopped exactly where the plan predicted it would be stopped. He noted that the Americans appeared to be, in his words, in confusion, without coordinated response, taking casualties. He had been watching for less than 4 minutes. He had not yet understood what he was seeing. This video is the kind of content that only survives if you keep it alive. A like takes 2 seconds. For the men of the 37th Tank Battalion who held that ditch, it's the least we can do. What happened next would change his assessment completely and establish a principle of American armor that would haunt German commanders for the rest of the war. Here is what Patton taught his commanders that most military theorists had never written down cleanly enough to be doctrine. He called it the indirect mind. He'd been developing it for years before the war, reading cavalry doctrine, reading Roman military history, reading Rommel's own published accounts of his First World War infantry tactics. And by the time he had an army under his command, and it had crystallized into something he stated with characteristic directness: never attack where the enemy is strong. Attack where he thinks he is. Attack the gap between his reality and his expectation. That quote is from a recorded briefing Patton gave to Third Army officers in June 1944, transcribed by his aide-de-camp. Every officer in the 4th Armored Division had heard some version of it. Many had it written in the front of their field notebooks. Donahue had it in his head. He'd been thinking about it for 7 weeks, applying it in small ways every time the column met resistance, and the instinct of every man in the vehicle was to push straight through. Now crouching in a drainage canal in Lorraine with 8 men, 2 Thompsons, 1 machine gun, and the realization that the enemy had positioned their anti-tank guns on the road because they expected the Americans to stay on the road, Donahue thought about what the enemy had not prepared for. The harvested fields, open ground, tank country, theoretically. But the German guns were angled toward the road, not toward the fields. Repositioning anti-tank guns was slow. It required unlimbering, re-emplacing, re-registering targets. If he could get his remaining mobile tanks, he had 5 still functional, though one had a cracked sight, off the road and into the fields to the north of the town. They would be approaching from a direction that the German guns could not immediately engage. It would require moving through a French farmstead that sat on the field's edge. He could see it from the ditch. A stone-walled compound, in typical Lorraine construction, white plastered walls, a red tile roof, a barn. And as he watched it through his binoculars, he saw something he hadn't expected. A face in an upper window. Then 2, then a child's face below the adult, peering over a sill. There was a family in that farmhouse. The route he needed ran directly past the farmhouse, close enough that any German MG team using it as cover would catch his tanks in the open at 200 meters. And if the Germans were using it, any fire he directed at the farmhouse would shred everyone inside. He had to know before he moved. He wrote a note, in his best schoolboy French, phonetically remembered from 6 weeks of mandatory language training at Fort Knox, and gave it to Private Morrow with directions to get it to the farmhouse without getting shot. Morrow, who was 20 years old and from Louisiana, and later told his mother he had never been as terrified as those 40 yards, did it. Ran bent double along the ditch, scaled the stone wall, and shoved the note under the door. The response came back in 11 minutes. A white undershirt hung from the barn window. No Germans inside. Family in the cellar. "Stay there," Donahue wrote back, and sent Morrow again. "Do not come out for any reason until the shooting stops completely." Elias Morrow, Private First Class, 37th Tank Battalion, age 20, Shreveport, Louisiana, wrote to his mother in October 1944. "There was a little girl in that house. I could see her through the crack in the barn door when I was coming back. She had a doll with yellow hair. She was completely still, holding the doll, looking at me. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, but I didn't have enough French, and there wasn't time. I just looked at her and put my finger to my lips. She copied me back, like a mirror. I think about that girl more than I think about the shooting." The route was clear. The plan was dangerous, unconventional, dependent on 3 things: the German gunners not repositioning quickly enough, the 5 remaining Shermans not silhouetting themselves on the field's slight rise, and the German commander being exactly as road-focused as his initial deployment suggested. Patton's principle: attack the gap between the enemy's reality and his expectation. The German expectation was that the Americans were pinned, confused, and waiting for orders. Donahue moved at 07:18, and he had the 5 mobile tanks swing north through a gap in a hedge, the kind of gap a farm wagon would use, wide enough for a Sherman at low speed, and directed them across the field on a heading that would bring them around Arracourt's northern edge rather than up its throat. He stayed on foot in the drainage canal with his infantry element, moving parallel to the tank route, but closer to the road, where the German guns were focused. The first 300 meters took 11 minutes. Tanks on open ground moved faster than that, but the field had soft patches from autumn rain, and the 4th tank, Corporal Danny Espinosa's C-14 Lone Star, went into one of them to its bow armor at 07:23. Stuck completely. Espinosa's gunner, a man named Hutchins, climbed out and started digging with his bare hands. 3 tanks left moving, the 2 functional gun sights between them. The German anti-tank gun crews on the road had not yet seen the maneuvering tanks. They were watching the burning hulks on the road and the occasional muzzle flash from Donahue's machine gun team, which he'd positioned to keep them watching the ditch. But at 07:29, a German Panzer grenadier, moving from one position to another, looked north across the field and saw something that stopped him cold. He started shouting. The right side AT gun crew swung their piece toward the field. At 200 meters, a 75 millimeter anti-tank gun against a Sherman is a kill shot. No argument, no armor angle that saves you. The first round went long. They'd rushed the traverse, and through mud and wheat stubble 20 meters in front of the lead Sherman. The second round was going to be on target. It wasn't. Yet because at the exact moment the gun crew finished loading the second round, the German Panzer Grenadier, platoon leader on the road, suddenly had a much larger problem. The infantry element he thought was pinned in the ditch had gotten up and was now 30 meters from his left side machine gun nest and moving at a run. Donahue, personally, was the first man out of the ditch. 6 seconds of open ground. One machine gun nest between him and the AT gun's ability to traverse safely. He hit the ground once. His Thompson stuttered, jammed, unjammed, came up and kept running. The machine gun nest didn't rotate in time. What followed was the kind of close combat that doesn't translate well to military maps or after-action reports. A drainage canal, a road shoulder, 7 men against a fortified platoon, fought at ranges measured in yards, where Private First Class Theodore Buck Kowalski, 23, of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who had been a machinist before the war, and moved through a firefight with the same methodical precision he'd applied to assembly lines, cleared 2 positions in 6 minutes with a bar. He was hit in the left arm at 0733 and kept moving. Buck never said a word about it, Donahue wrote in his after-action report. I didn't know he was hit until after the gun position was taken, and I saw him wrapping his own arm with his field dressing. He said, "I'll tell you after." I did not ask him what he meant. The 3 functioning Shermans reached the northern edge of Arracourt at 0741. They came into the town from a direction the German commander had left completely open, not because he was incompetent, but because the road from the north ran through terrain his map had marked as impassable for armor after recent rain. His map was accurate about the rain. It was wrong about impassable for crews who'd been driving Shermans through French mud for 7 weeks and had developed an almost physical instinct for what ground would hold. The lead tank, commanded by Sergeant First Class Harold Park, 31, from Spokane, Washington, the most experienced tank commander in the company after Donahue's vehicle was knocked out, came around the corner of Arracourt's grain mill at 0742 and found himself looking at the side armor of a Panzer IV that had been positioned to cover the southern approach. The side armor. At 0742, Park's gunner, Corporal Reyes, fired. At 0742, and approximately 4 seconds, the Panzer IV ceased to exist as a fighting vehicle. The German commander, a Hauptmann, whose name appears in the Wehrmacht field logs as Hoffmann W., but whose full identity was never confirmed in post-war records, had designed his entire defensive scheme around the road. His AT guns covered the road. His machine guns covered the road. His mortar team was registered on the road. The town's northern buildings he'd left with a single infantry picket because no armor was coming from there. His expectation had been his vulnerability. By 0800, Donahue had linked up with Park's 3 tanks in the town's central square. The Panzer Grenadier platoon on the road, cut off from their command, under fire from front and flank simultaneously, was breaking. By 0815, 12 German soldiers had surrendered, and the rest had withdrawn eastward on foot. The AT guns, unable to reposition fast enough, were abandoned. At 0823, Morrow raised battalion on the portable radio. Arracourt crossroads secure, he reported. 1 AT gun captured. 1 Panzer IV destroyed. Request ammunition resupply? request medical forward, and request someone tells Able Company they can stand down. He paused. Also, the radio is working fine. Buck Kowalski was loaded onto a vehicle at 0840. He had not once mentioned his arm during the fighting. His wound was serious enough to require evacuation, but not serious enough to cost him the arm, which he needed because he went back to the machinist's work after the war. He died in Milwaukee in 1987 at the age of 66. The town square in Arracourt was silent by 900, except for the sound of a Sherman engine cooling. And, from somewhere in the direction of the butcher's shop, a French radio that someone had left playing. Donahue sat on the hull of Park's tank. He was not celebrating. He was looking at the bent barrel of C-17, visible in the ditch, on the road below the square, and thinking about the photograph behind its compass. His mother, in a wheat elevator, in Kansas. He had not yet written her about any of this. He wasn't sure he knew how to start. At the German 111th Panzer Brigade headquarters, the brigade commander was reading Hauptmann Hoffmann's damage report with an expression his adjutant later described as like a man who has received news he does not believe but cannot dispute. The Americans had come from the wrong direction. They had moved through ground his own armored vehicles would not have risked. They had done it while simultaneously conducting a close assault against a fortified road position with a handful of infantry. His after-action dispatch to 5th Panzer Army used language that his own staff found jarring, given his earlier confidence. He described the American maneuvering as unexpected in its speed and improvisation, and noted, with what reads as genuine bewilderment, that the American ground forces appeared to have no fixed preference for any single axis of approach. It was, in 4 words, Patton's indirect mind. The enemy had finally run directly into it. The Battle of Arracourt, the broader engagement that the 37th Tank Battalion's action was part of, ran from September 18th to September 29th, 1944, and became one of the largest tank battles on the Western Front. By the time it was over, the 4th Armored Division had destroyed or captured 285 German armored vehicles and effectively wrecked 2 Panzer brigades. American losses were significant, 47 Shermans destroyed or knocked out, but the exchange ratio told a story that German Armored Command had difficulty accepting. The Arracourt crossroads fell on September 19th and held. The battlefield, when it was over, had the specific ugliness of all tank battles: burned-out hulls in the middle of French roads, churned field edges where vehicles had tried to maneuver in soft earth, the peculiar absence of the sounds that had filled the air for 9 days. The church in Arracourt was intact. The butcher's shop had a wall removed by a stray round. The farmhouse north of the road, the one where the child had held her doll in the window, had no damage whatsoever. Our prisoner interrogations conducted by Third Army Intelligence in the following days produced testimony that American debriefers found striking. An Unteroffizier from the 111th Panzer Brigade, 22 years old, veteran of the Eastern Front, said the following, translated and recorded in Third Army's intelligence summary for September 29, 1944. We had been told the Americans use their tanks like trucks, drive fast, shoot where they're pointed, call for air if it goes wrong. They did not do that. They read the ground. They gave up their best road and used our worst terrain. I have not seen that kind of reading from any enemy I have faced. General Major Horst Freiherr von Wende, to commanding officer of the 11th Panzer Division, who had reviewed the Arracourt engagement as part of a broader 5th Panzer Army assessment, wrote in an evaluation dated October 4th, 1944, that American armored forces had demonstrated a tactical flexibility inconsistent with the training assessments we had received. He noted, with a specificity that reveals genuine professional discomfort, that the American willingness to abandon planned routes and improvise under fire suggests an officer and NCO corps trained to exercise independent judgment at levels we had not anticipated. He had, 6 days before the battle, been on record as predicting that Patton's forces would exhaust themselves on German positions through directness. He crossed that assessment out in his own hand in the margin of his own document, and Patton received the report of the Arracourt action late on September 19th. His diary entry for that evening, as published in the Patton papers, contains no dramatic flourish. He wrote, "37th Tank Battalion performed exactly as I have always believed American soldiers would perform when commanded by men who think, not just men who follow." It is as close as Patton ever came to a compliment that wasn't also a challenge. Donahue was not decorated for Arracourt immediately. The commendation took 4 months to process through the bureaucracy of a moving army. He received the Silver Star in January 1945. The citation described his actions in the flat language of official documents, displayed conspicuous gallantry, and maintained aggressive action, which is the Army's way of saying, without saying, in that he did what Patton's training had prepared him to do. Read the obstacle as information, identify the enemy's assumption, and attack the gap. The lesson of Arracourt is not that American tanks were better. By most technical measurements in 1944, they were not. The Panther outranged and outgunned the Sherman in a direct engagement. The lesson is that the system the Americans had built, the doctrine, the NCO authority, the willingness to deviate from a failing plan without waiting for permission, was better. Patton had created an army that could fail forward, improvise under pressure, and find the angle that the enemy's rigidity had left open. Against an enemy whose command culture demanded that NCOs and junior officers hold position and request instructions, it was like playing chess against someone who refused to castle because the rules said castling was optional. The Germans weren't bad soldiers at Arracourt. They were inflexible ones. And inflexibility in a fluid battle is a weapon you hand to your enemy. Read those numbers again. 285 German armored vehicles against 47 American losses over 11 days in a sector where German armor outnumbered American armor and held prepared positions. That is not luck. That is doctrine meeting human courage at the exact right moment. Raymond Donahue survived the war. He returned to Abilene in August 1945. He took over part of his grandfather's wheat elevator operation. He never named any of his vehicles after that. Not trucks, not tractors, nothing with an engine. His family assumed he'd just never picked up the habit. He died in 1991. His Silver Star citation is in a frame in the Abilene Public Library's local history section. It is not in a prominent place. You have to know to look for it. The church at Arracourt still stands. The crossroads is still there. If you drive the D674 from the southwest on a September morning, you will come over a shallow rise and see the steeple exactly as Donahue saw it at 0612 on September 19th, 1944, with the fields open on both sides and the road running straight toward it. The chickens are gone, but the ground is the same. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served in Patton's Third Army, in the 4th Armored Division, or anywhere in the Lorraine Campaign of 1944, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit? What town? Where did they end up? Those stories exist in family memory and nowhere else, and they belong to all of us. If the story of Raymond Donahue and the men of Charlie Company has stayed with you, the channel that brings you history like this needs your support to keep going. A subscription takes 5 seconds. For the men who bought those seconds with something considerably more expensive, it is worth the effort.